Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. We are not taking a holiday break. We do this every week, rain or shine, unless both of us are traveling internationally. Unless we can't. Yeah. But we're both home or at a place that we can sit down and take a deep breath and introduce new FUD into your life. Welcome, Colin, to Bitcoin Season 2.
Thank you, Charlie. Hope you had a Merry Christmas, and hope all of our dedicated listeners had a very Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, whatever holiday you're celebrating at the end of the year. It's a cozy season. So,
yep, cozy season is in full effect, but we're going to try to create a little tension in your life by introducing some new FUD, because Bitcoin, I'm convinced Bitcoin doesn't actually work if it doesn't have some kind of FUD hanging over it. And today, that FUD is related to Russia. Ooh.
but not for the reasons you might think.
Not for the reasons you might
Honestly,
think.
kind of the opposite reason of the mainstream FUD of making Russia a boogeyman in American politics. This is kind of the opposite. This is Russia kind of shooting itself in the foot, maybe, or not. We don't know if it's true. So
yeah, this is Russia. They clearly didn't read Jason Lowery's
software thesis.
and then we're going to talk about this topic of OFAC sanctions. Is F2 pool sanctioning OFAC addresses? Ooh. So before we get into that, a word from our sponsor. Bitcoin Season 2 is brought to you by Botanix. Botanix Labs is pioneering a new direction for DeFi with the first EVM L2 running on Bitcoin that's built to be forward secure, decentralized, and share gas fees generated by the network with users. See the future of DeFi at Botanix, botanixlabs.xyz. Okay, so first topic in the FUD list is going to be, is Russia the new China? Colin, what's going on?
Yeah, so a news story from a local Russian paper called TASS, I believe is the name.
TASS, yeah.
Broke, and if you can go ahead and throw it up,
I'll pull it up
for all of our dear readers and listeners. Basically, this idea that Russia has approved a list of territories to ban mining from January 2025 up till March 15th, 2031. And that's contingent, right? Like they might lift it earlier, but like the longest life of this ban will be about 6 years or so, 6 years and 3 months, more or less. So yeah, this almost seems like China mining ban round 2, but in Russia, it seems to be regionally focused. It does not say that it is a blanket ban on all mining in Russia, but it does seem to indicate that the Russian government could be cracking down on Bitcoin mining. There are a couple of questions that I have about this, and we're going to have a pod for the mining pod hopefully next week. I plan to record it on Monday. Maybe we'll expedite it, but it might not get released until the second week of January. But the question for this is this cracking down on all mining? Is this just cracking down on cowboy mining, people tapping into the grid without formal PPAs or without letting their operators know? Which regions are actually caught in the crossfire here? And what is the real reason for this? Because they cite energy shortages. And I find that not surprising, given the fact that Russia is largely supported by oil and gas, and the war in Ukraine is still, churning away, and they need those oil and gas resources to fund their war machine. They're also cut off from other oil producers. Now, they don't really need, I guess, to import their own oil. But in
Russia is one of the largest energy producers in the world.
Yeah.
Top, I think 3, I think.
Yeah, for sure. But I wonder, it's like if you have a significant portion of your oil reserves going to a war effort, you would obviously want maybe to bolster your reserves or your supply by importing. They can't do that from Canada right now. They can't do that from the US. I'm unaware if they could do it from Saudi or some of the Middle Eastern countries. There are a few that they probably could that have not sanctioned them. But it seems to me like the Ukrainian war is the backdrop for some of this. If there are energy shortages, I don't know how drastic they are, but hopefully get some clarity on that soon. And this could really be a wild card for Bitcoin's hash rate. Russia probably houses around 10% of Bitcoin's global hash rate. If this ban does take effect and it does involve some of the larger producers of hash rate in the region, then you could see Bitcoin's hash rate drop significantly. In fact, we might get a better read on just how much hash rate is in Russia if this goes into effect. Seeing
Yeah,
what happens over the next
this is
few
really
weeks.
interesting because like I remember like back in the China mining FUD, China would finger quotes ban Bitcoin all the time, and it never happened until it did. And then when it did, we got to see just how much hash rate was actually online in China. And it was close to what everybody had estimated, which was roughly half the network, because we saw 40% drawdown in hash rate, Bitcoin hash rate in like a 2-week period or something. And so if Russia does this, now this only covers like 10 regions in Russia. And this is a bit, frankly, this is a bit of a black box to, Colin and I and a lot of other Western analysts. But like, we can get to see a little bit of a test of like how much hash rate might be online in Russia. I mean,
100%.
Colin, you said like 10%. We see numbers across the board. I don't really know exactly what to think. I think Russia is considered to be 2 or 3 largest, the second or
Yeah,
third.
the last time we talked to some people for a article we wrote for the Mining Pod newsletter, I believe it was about a month and a half ago. It was like China is in second, USA is in first, and then Russia is in third. And so far, we haven't seen any crazy curtailment of Bitcoin's hash rate as a result of this.
Yeah.
Bitcoin's hash rate has fallen over the last, call it 4 days from 795 exahashes on the 7-day to 779. That's not a very big drop. That's
well
like
within normal variance,
2%.
like normal week-to-week variance. Like if you
Yeah,
saw this, you'd be
that's
like,
normal
doesn't look like
variance.
anything crazy happened this week.
Yeah, and I wonder, it's like, so for the China mining ban, you could actually see multiple periods of kind of hash rate blackout or brownout. Maybe there was a crash in April that people attributed to the migration of miners from the from Sichuan to the coal mining regions like Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang. The China mining, the seasonal mining migration in China that people would always talk about in the rainy season. They mine in Sichuan where the dams are, and then in the dry season they go to the coal heavy regions to make use of cheap coal power. But what that actually was miners packing up who had gotten the notice early and trying to get ahead of everyone rushing for the exit, right? So I feel like for this ban, you would potentially see some hash rate already coming offline. Maybe the Russian miners will just keep running until they're told to stop. But again, I think the biggest question for this is really like, how deep is this ban going to go? Is this even legitimate? I mean, it's from a Russian news source. Seems like it's probably legitimate.
Yeah, and the other thing is like, okay, so it's Russian officials. Again, Russia is still a new player in the global stage of Bitcoin mining at this level. And I think back to when like China would finger quotes ban Bitcoin, and everybody really knew. We eventually kind of knew this at an institutional level, like in the industry. It was like, okay, well, the actual miners have deals with province officials to like pony up cash on the side or like do backroom deals so they stay online. And um and again, I'm going out on a limb here, but I think Russia probably culturally and politically may have a similar structure to that, and we don't know about that. And then the other one is Russia's a very big place, and we know that there's a lot that a lot of mining is concentrated in the Siberian region of Russia. And then the question is, because my Russian geography is a little out of date, where are the actual regions that are named these 10 regions? And then does this compromise those regions? And another angle to this is that they said energy shortages, and then the other one, which is my new favorite FUD term, which is the so-called interregional cross-subsidization, which means TLDR, you have a few different like regions or locales in a country, and one region is paying kind of subsidizing for an adjacent region. You see this often in power grids, where power grids span more than just the legal state jurisdictions. And so the power grid finances things. So if one particular region is enjoying abundant, low cost, cheap power, because of distribution and transmission, it may sometimes be asymmetrically paid by people who are not enjoying that same low cost power in an adjacent region. So this is a thing we've seen this a lot in the United States, maybe not to the downside, but really this has become a common beat in the stories of like, my power rate's gone up because the Bitcoin mine down the street is on, and we have similar types of conversations.
Right. A few more just background notes for this whole thing. In this article that we published on Blockspace a while back, Yaron Mellerud of Hash Labs, he's the CEO of Hash Labs, a Bitcoin mining software or a Bitcoin mining services company. And he said that the Russian market has become saturated and that there are no expansion possibilities due to higher power prices and difficulties in obtaining new grid connections. A problem that has persisted for several months. Perhaps we're seeing this come to a head. We also had multiple different ASIC providers and also just miners who are aware of the region saying that some ASIC wholesalers and brokers had like half of their volume coming from Russia in the past year. And so I feel like you've seen perhaps critical mass being reached in the Russian market, and there's just not enough room to accommodate the demand that has been serviced from all of these people buying up ASICs. It's also really telling. One last little note. I interviewed the MicroBT team, the CEO, and one of their marketing managers while I was in Abu Dhabi for the Bitcoin MENA conference. Don't know if we'll air that interview. I might just do a transcript of it. It was pretty, the marketing manager had to translate for the CEO. I just don't know if it would make for the best podcast experience. Yeah. But I asked them, where are you seeing the most volume outside of the US right now? And he wouldn't answer Russia. He said that we're selling a lot to South America. And to me, that kind of elided the truth that they probably are selling quite a few rigs to Russia. They just don't want to say that on the record for a number of reasons. But Russia has been one of the larger consumers of hash rate over the last year or so. So potentially catastrophic news coming for their mining industry. I mean, you got to pour one out for the homies who invested millions of dollars in.
They got their yachts seized. The oligarchs got their yachts seized after Ukraine. They got their bank accounts closed. Now their own government's coming after them for hash rate. Damn,
it's tough.
Pour a big bottle of vodka out for the homies.
Pour a big bottle of Russian Standard and open up a can of caviar if you got it.
A can of caviar. Crack a Bush Light, because that's a U.S. beer.
That's what they're going to be drinking after this ban.
So we don't normally lead with heavy mining news, but I think this is pretty interesting because I want to try to theme the writer's room with FUD, and also I hadn't really heard any other talking heads talk about this yet. So we're gonna do it. So switching gears, part 2 of
more mining FUD,
and
legitimate mining FUD.
Yeah, this is actually legitimate mining FUD, and pay attention because you might learn something. If you're listening to this and you don't know about this business of sanctioning Bitcoin transactions, this could be pretty educational. So I'll do a little premise here. So last week, there's a handful of Bitcoin researchers who kind of watch transactions on Bitcoin, and one of these researchers, go by the pseudonym OXB10C, has a tool called Mempool Observer, and it observed a transaction which may have been removed from a block because it went to a sanctioned address as per the OFAC list. OFAC is basically the blacklist for Western countries to say, these are the entities which we've identified as people we don't allow you to send money to. And the question is, do Bitcoin miners, do the pools themselves censor these OFAC transactions? So it's been kind of a story off and on over the past 5 years or so. We haven't really seen it happen at scale, but everyone's some people are paying very close attention to this. And we saw what could be two transactions which had been not included by when they might have been expected to in a block, but those transactions were then later included in a block by another U.S. entity. I'm gonna throw this to you, Colin, to maybe touch on this, and then I can go down the rabbit hole of the mechanics of sanctioning transactions.
Yeah, you hit on kind of the high level stuff. So the Office of Foreign Assets Control is a U.S. government office that puts entities on the sanctions list that basically says if you engage in trade with these entities, if you have any economic ties to them, then you are going to feel the bruising hammer of U.S. federal law. And for Bitcoin mining specifically, there has never been an official edict or law from the US government that says do not include transactions in blocks from sanctioned addresses. The OFAC has sanctioned Bitcoin addresses that belong to terrorist organizations or other entities on the sanctions list, but they have not. There's been no government office or no agency or law from Congress or an executive order or anything like that that explicitly states that Bitcoin miners cannot touch transactions from these addresses. But that has not stopped miners from doing things like censoring these transactions. Most famously, I'm going to share my screen really quickly. This was, I believe, probably the first time this really came up in the news cycle. In May of 2021, Marathon became the first North American pool to produce or miner to produce a fully, anti-money laundering and OFAC compliant Bitcoin block. And so basically what they did is they created a filter in Marapool, which was pretty nascent at the time. I don't think they had even branded it Marapool. I could be wrong about that. But they created a filter and they would not mine transactions from addresses that were associated with or on the OFAC sanctions list. Now, this effort was very short-lived. I think they did it for all of 2 months, and then they scuttled it because they were missing out on like several percentage points of revenue. Like I think upwards of like 20% or 30%, depending on the block.
It's kind of funny how like much revenue. Yeah, they weren't like there was some outcry from the Bitcoin community at the time, but I don't think that was the reason they stopped. It was a financial one.
100%. Yeah, because Marathon doesn't care what plebs are saying on Twitter. Like you can screech autistically about censorship-resistant internet money, but like Marathon only cares about its share price and its shareholders, and they weren't changing anything about their censorship for anyone else or for any pressure that they faced from the community. But yeah, it was a total revenue thing. And I think that's what this has always been kind of the game theoretic argument, right? Is that eventually, yeah, like mining pools or large miners, really mining pools, let's just be honest about it, right? Like there's not really any self-mining going on in any meaningful scale. Mining pools will censor transactions under this scenario, but then they'll get mined in another miner's block and that miner will make those transaction fees, and then it'll disincentivize the miners who are censoring to do it because they're not going to be making as much money. And then for a mining pool, if you're not getting enough payouts from that mining pool, if your payouts are handicapped based on the fact that they won't mine transactions, then you're going to leave to go to another pool. Now, full paper share, which is the dominant payout method, fucks with this a little bit. So full paper share basically says the mining pool will pay out a standard rate to their miners, regardless of how many blocks they mine. This messes with it a little bit, but then there is the consideration that, let's say you're taking a 20% haircut because you're censoring transactions. Well, you're a mining pool. You're still paying out a market rate based on what other miners are mining to your miners, and you are going to become insolvent eventually because of that. So maybe that balances the power. But like, I think that this is an important story, and I'll throw it back to you after this, Charlie. Because at the end of the day, mining pools are a serious attack vector for Bitcoin censorship resistance, especially if those mining pools reside in the US or service US miners. Because if the US government says, hey, by the way, actually, you can't mine transactions from these addresses because we have sanctioned them, then you basically, for however much, 50% of the network, maybe more if they even ask pools who are not based in the US but service US clients, then you basically create a choke point for transactions, and they won't be able to be mined in blocks as quickly as they otherwise would because you're forcing these companies to censor them from their blocks. So it's probably one of the more serious attack vectors with Bitcoin, and it's complicated when you take public miners into account, because they could also just go to the public miners and say this, and then the public miners would lobby their pools or build their own pools, like, and do what Marathon did and sanction these transactions. So anyway,
I think that's a really good overview. I'm going to spend a few minutes, if you listener are listening to this and you want to, I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of explaining the mechanics of like how we actually watch this and observe this, because you'll see a news story like what Colin just brought up, which is like, miner is sanctioning addresses. Well, I think it's really important to understand how this happens. So let's take a look. This is from Mining Pool Observer, or miningpool.observer, which is the tool that OXB10C, the researcher who identified this, it's a tool that they run, and it basically flags if transactions look certain ways sometimes. And it has a special flag which identifies transactions, UTXOs, which are sent to the known list of OFAC sanctioned addresses. Diving a little bit deeper, I saw that there were, I believe, 430 something addresses which are on the OFAC sanctions list. So what this does is, if the node that powers this website, miningpool.observer, sees a transaction which is headed to one of those addresses, one of those banned addresses, it will flag it as this is a transaction which is headed to a sanctioned address. And then it will look at the block templates from each of from the next it'll look at the next expected block template, and which would be expected. If you go to like mempool.space, you'll see like, oh, it looks like my transaction is going to be included in the next block, and that's just mempool.space's interpretation of what they would expect. So miningpool.observer does a similar thing where they're like, we would expect this sanctioned transaction to be in the next block. So if it's not, then the pool that doesn't include that transaction may be sanctioning transactions to this OFAC list, if this makes sense. So what we saw was miningpool.observer saw a sanctioned transaction come in, and then it was not included in a block mined by F2 pool immediately thereafter. Funnily enough, as Colin said, it was included in a Foundry block 2 blocks later. Foundry is a US entity. F2 is a, I believe, Chinese, or I believe they're a Chinese entity, but I don't know where they're at.
Yeah, they're run by Chinese citizens, but they're probably incorporated somewhere else at this point.
Exactly. So so we would just have one data point here which says F2 pool might be censoring, but it's hard to know for sure. But then we saw another transaction within 24 hours, similar type of transaction, headed to a similarly sanctioned address, which was also filtered by F2 pool. I'm not going to use the term filtered, was not included in the block by F2 pool. However, both of these transactions were a little bit the likelihood with which we can assign that it was actually filtered is kind of low, because each transaction was actually broadcast to the Bitcoin network relatively soon, or there was a block found relatively soon after these transactions appeared. So sometimes, due to the way transactions get like gossiped around the Bitcoin network, the way the transactions get passed around from node to node and then eventually find their way to a Bitcoin miner's node or a pool's node, they may have shown up a little bit too late to kind of be included into the block. And one of these cases, the fee of one of the transactions was just kind of right on the edge of it being a high enough fee to be included in the block. And the other one, it showed up anywhere from 6 to 20 seconds before the block happened. So it's kind of relatively soon. Maybe that didn't actually get into the block. So both of these situations are not like high confidence indications that F2 pool is censoring. That was a really long way to try to explain it, but I think it's important because
I think it is,
yeah, as we try to like talk about like what it means to sanction an address, like these are the mechanics, and this will help you pierce through the noise, because almost certainly someone somewhere over the next few years is going to do OFAC sanctioning. Like statistically, as governments become more punitive and as mining goes through this weird, do we like it, do we hate it cycle based on what country you're in, we're going to see this. So it helps to know the mechanics of this, so that you don't read a news story which is like, which might look like one of ours, where we have a title which is F2 pools entering in transactions, and then we actually explain, well, it doesn't appear that, but it's on our radar. So like that's important to like have those like that understanding. I'm going to throw it to you, Colin, for any thoughts on your end.
No, I think that really encapsulates it. We don't know if this was actually censorship. We don't want to accuse F2 Pool of doing something that they're not doing. If it's strange that if it were an OFAC sanctioned address, that Foundry picked it up.
Yeah.
But then again, these US pools currently, as far as I can tell, don't really discriminate. But maybe I'm wrong about that. The other thing about that is I don't know how sophisticated their chain analysis software is, because theoretically, if an address is sanctioned, then it just splits those coins off, sends them to another address. And is OFAC going to update that? Are they going to update their sanction list to accommodate those addresses that were offshoots of the original address? And even if they're not, their chain analysis could certainly have, that's the premier U.S. intelligence agency.
They're like the Palantir of Bitcoin.
The Palantir of exactly, of Bitcoin surveillance, has the blessing of all the alphabet soup agencies.
Yeah.
But, chain analysis certainly has the ability to track. I mean, any chain analysis software that's worth its salt has the ability to trace those transactions with degrees of complete certainty and tag them accordingly. One last thing I wanted to note, the fee on that transaction was crazy. It was like 385,000 sats, 360,000 sats. It was a huge transaction. It was like 87,000 bytes.
There were a couple transactions. Let me see.
Okay, so it was there. Okay,
which one it is?
The one that
you were was not a very high fee.
There was one the last one that you were looking at before you bumped it off. Anyway, wonder. I haven't looked into what the actual transaction was. Maybe it was just a simple fact that like maybe it didn't get relayed quickly enough for F2 Pool's mempool. I don't know.
Oh yeah. Oh wait, no, that was the fees for the template, the whole block.
Oh, that makes
the fee for the transaction was, for one of the transactions was 345,000 sats, and the fee for the other one was
well, no, 340,000 sats is pretty. That's
it is high.
That's
and almost 342,000 satoshis, but
it was super data heavy. So it must have been maybe they were consolidating a bunch of UTXOs or something.
I didn't get into this. They were actually consolidating a bunch of multi-sig outputs.
If you want to go even deeper,
if you want to go even deeper, it is this transaction looks like an exchange output consolidation to a sanctioned address. This looks like an exchange is consolidating a bunch of UTXOs that they hold in a multi-sig to a sanctioned address. So
makes sense.
Yeah. I also think it's like important to note that like I think that the average person's understanding of what an address is still a little little immature, because like you see this in like the ordinals world, where people think that they have an Xverse wallet and they have a bunch of different addresses for that wallet, that they're all different wallets. No, those are all from the same private key. Those are just different public addresses which are derived from your X pub. So those are all addresses to the same, I would call those all the same wallet, but different addresses for the wallet. So what we're seeing is, I don't know if OFAC actually has the X pub for certain entities, or if they've just flagged certain addresses from that X pub.
Well, yeah, they definitely flag addresses, right? Unless there's been a leak. Because the only way they would have the X pub is if that was shared publicly, or if they're going to I don't know, an exchange or a wallet service that would have that information stored, but I don't know how that would work. Like, there's no way that they would know necessarily
Yeah.
what unless there was some sort of information leak, they wouldn't know where the funds are coming from in terms of wallets or exchanges.
Yep.
But maybe they do. Maybe Big Brother has eyes everywhere, and they do. So
I think Big Brother chooses to have eyes when they kind of arbitrarily, like they just dropped some IRS DeFi regulations, which I haven't had a chance to read through yet. Maybe that'll.
I'm avoiding that for the NSA/IRS agent listening to this. Fix yourself. I don't know.
I don't know what DeFi stands for. Is it destructive fidelity?
It's destructive finance.
Finance?
It's just finance
I don't
that
like that.
immiserates
That
you.
sounds bad.
It's finance that immiserates you and leaves you poor, living in a van down by the river.
That's DeFi. That is DeFi. That's everyone I know. Well, on that note, we got some listener comments. Sovereign Stoic, shout out to you. Good to see you.
Shout out to the homie. I hope you're doing well, man.
We got DK in the audience. Had to give a thumbs up. Two bros live talking to each other with zero audience. You guys are dope. Respect to you, DK, and tell your friends.
Thank you, DK, for the the compliment that also is somewhat of a slight.
That comment gets a hell yeah. And yeah, for everybody else in the audience, this is live. Feel free to chime in, but you won't have much time because we've got some final thoughts, I believe, from Colin.
Yeah, so there's a story that we did not cover that I think is really important.